Welcome back to Waking Nightmare. Tonight's story takes us to Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, one of the most studied archaeological sites in North America. Researchers have spent careers mapping it, excavating it, trying to understand it. In tonight's story, one of them finds something they weren't supposed to find. Let's get into it. The phone went off at 7:12 on a Tuesday in October. Screen down on the kitchen counter, rattling against the tile in a way that meant it had been ringing long enough to flip itself. I was still in yesterday's flannel, standing at the coffee maker with the kind of morning fog that takes a full cup to clear. I looked at the screen. Sally Cunningham. Second call. I picked up. "Tell me what you've got," I said, because that's how Sally and I worked. No preamble, she didn't call to chat. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds longer than it should have. That was the first thing I clocked. Sally doesn't pause. "I ran the northwestern perimeter last night," she said. "Along the base of the outer wall, Sector 7, the return data is..." Another pause, shorter this time. "Terry, I need you to look at this." I set down my mug. "What kind of return?" "A chamber, sealed, roughly 40 feet across, consistent geometry on all 4 sides. It's not a Kiva profile. The depth to width ratio is wrong and there's no central deflector signature. It's not a storage pit. The geometry is too regular and the ceiling impression is..." She stopped. "It's sitting directly below the section of outer wall they filled in, the plastered over section on the northwest face." I knew the section she meant. Everyone who'd worked that section knew it. A length of the outer wall that was deliberately backed with rubble fill and sealed over some time in the late occupation period, around 1130 CE, give or take. The scholarly consensus was defensive reinforcement, maybe ritual closure. I had written 3 pages on it in a chapter published 8 years ago, explaining it with confidence I could apparently afford at the time. "How clean is the return?" I asked. "Clean enough that I ran it 3 times. Her voice was level, but she was choosing her words with the careful spacing of someone keeping herself on the right side of something. "The anomaly doesn't shift. It doesn't degrade at the edges, Terry. It read like it was engineered to be exactly what it is." I didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll be there by noon," I said. She let out a breath. "Okay." I set the phone face down on the counter again and stood there looking at the coffee maker. 11 years teaching pre-Columbian studies at UNM, 7 of those years with Chaco as my primary site focus. I had driven Highway 550 out to the canyon so many times that the route ran itself. The long flat stretch past Cuba, the point where the road drops and the basin opens up and you can feel the elevation change in your ears. I had walked Pueblo Bonito's outer walls in 3 different seasons. I had taught its construction phases to 4 cohorts of undergraduates, had argued its solar alignments at 2 conferences, had written with the casual authority of someone who has spent enough time in a place to believe he's read its full inventory. That's the thing about familiarity. It feels like understanding. It isn't always. I got my bag off the hook by the door and started checking it by habit. Field notebook, hand lens, backup batteries for the Trimble unit. The small first aid kit I'd been restocking since a bad blister situation in 2019. The procedural rhythm helped. My hands knew the sequence and I let them run it while my head worked the geometry Sally had described. 40 feet across, consistent geometry on all 4 sides, positioned deliberately below a wall section that the Chacoans had just as deliberately sealed. Not hidden by accident, not forgotten, covered. There's a distinction there that I was already not comfortable with. I locked the house at 8:04, tossed the bag behind the passenger seat, and pulled out of the driveway with the truck still cold. The heater takes about 10 minutes to catch in October. I drove the first stretch of surface streets with my hands at 10 and 2, not thinking about anything in particular, which meant I was thinking about it constantly. Sally Cunningham is not a person who calls twice. She is not a person who pauses mid-sentence, or who asks you to come look at something when she could just send you the file. She has a rigorous, systematic mind and a very low tolerance for other people's uncertainty, which means she has an even lower tolerance for her own. For her to call at 7 in the morning and sound the way she'd sounded, controlled, yes, always controlled, but with the particular flatness underneath, the kind that comes from keeping a lid on something, that meant the data was exactly what she said it was. I merged onto 550 North and let the truck find its speed. The Sandia Mountains were still in morning shadow behind me, the high desert rolling out flat and tawny ahead. I'd made this drive in 100 different states of mind. Tired, bored, professionally energized, occasionally annoyed at traffic near Rio Rancho. I had never made it feeling like I was driving towards something that had already been there. In the dark below the canyon floor, waiting with a patience I didn't have a category for yet, I turned the heater up and kept driving. Sally was standing at the trailhead when I pulled in, arms crossed against the October wind. Her field jacket unzipped because she always runs warm. She had her tablet tucked under one arm and her hair pulled back in the kind of hasty ponytail that meant she hadn't been home. She didn't say anything when I got out of the truck, just nodded toward the woman standing 10 feet to her left. Grace Woods. I had met her once at a SAA conference in Albuquerque 4 years back. She had spent 23 years as the NPS archaeologist assigned to Chaco, which meant she had cataloged more square footage of Chacoan architecture than almost anyone alive. She had her hands in the pockets of her NPS jacket, her jaw set, and she was watching me cross the parking area with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to hold something in until the right moment. Dr. Schultz? She offered her hand, firm, brief. Terry's fine. I shook it. Sally told me you'd be here. Sally told me the same about you. She glanced at Sally, then back at me. I want to show you something before we walk the perimeter. I want to show you because I should have said something 8 months ago and I didn't, and I'd rather get that on the table now. I waited. My team ran a GPR survey of the northwestern sector in February. Routine pass, part of our annual structural assessment. She pulled her hands from her pocket and crossed her arms instead. Not defensively, more like she was steadying herself against something. We flagged an anomaly at the base of the outer wall. Same formation Sally's describing. 40 feet across, consistent geometry, no Kiva signature. Sally was looking at the ground. We shelved it, Grace said. I made the call. We couldn't classify what we were seeing, and I wasn't ready to put something unclassifiable into an official report. So we documented it internally, marked it low priority, and moved on. She said this without an apology, just as a statement of what had happened. That was the wrong call. I didn't argue the point, she knew it better than I did. What changed? I asked. Sally's data. She paused. And one additional detail we logged in February that I didn't include in the internal documentation because I didn't know what to do with it. She pulled out her own tablet, opened a file, and handed it to me. It was a radar return chart, February timestamp, her team's equipment signature in the header. The chamber geometry was identical to what Sally had described on the phone. I spent a moment with it, long enough to confirm that, and handed it back. The walls, Grace said. Look at the return amplitude on the wall surfaces. I looked again before returning it. The amplitude was wrong. Not wrong like instrument error. Wrong like the material wasn't sandstone. The return was too clean and consistent. The kind of surface reflection you'd get from something dense and unbroken, without the irregular scatter that rough-cut stones produce. Glass smooth, I said. Consistent with it. Not rough-cut sandstone, not plaster over rubble. Something else. She took the tablet back. We have nothing in the Chacoan record that produces a return like that. I pulled every comparative data set I had access to. Nothing matches. The wind moved through the canyon rim above us, dry and cold. Sally was still looking at the ground. We walked the northwestern perimeter for the rest of the afternoon. Grace led, marking waypoints on her GPS unit while I logged observations in my field notebook and Sally managed the radar equipment. The outer wall face in Sector 7 was exactly as I remembered it from my own previous work here. The plastered over section running approximately 30 feet along the base, the rubble-backed fill visible in cross-section where erosion had opened a small gap near the corner. I had stood in front of this wall section before and written 3 pages about it. I had argued, in print, that the ceiling was ritual closure or defensive reinforcement. Standing in front of it now felt different. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete. We logged what we could from the surface, wall course heights, erosion patterns, and the GPS coordinates of the plastered section's boundaries. Grace noted a faint discoloration in the fill material near the base, slightly darker than the surrounding matrix, which could mean moisture retention, which could mean the chamber below maintained different thermal properties than the surrounding soil. She logged it without comment. I wrote it down. At 4:30, the light was going low and amber and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Sally had been quiet for most of the afternoon. Focused, her radar unit moving in careful parallel passes. She finished a final sweep, stood with the screen angled toward herself for a moment, then turned it so I could see. The chamber was not empty. I had been prepared, in the abstract way you prepare for something you've been told about, for the geometry. What I had not prepared for, what you could not prepare for from a phone description, was the return signature at the chamber's center. Something occupied it, dense, symmetrical, roughly humanoid in outline. The radar couldn't give me material composition or surface texture. It gave me mass and shape. What it gave me was enough. The form was wrong in ways I kept trying to rationalize and I couldn't. The torso read too long relative to the limb signatures. The arm geometry. The angle of the shoulder analogs. The trajectory of what should have been the forearm. Described positions no skeletal structure I had ever studied could achieve. Not a burial posture, not a desiccated body in a compression position, something else. I handed the screen back to Sally without speaking. She took it. Grace had been watching my face. She said, "We didn't see that in February. Either it wasn't there or our equipment resolution was insufficient to resolve it." Sally's unit is newer, I said. My voice came out flat and even, which I was grateful for. Yes. I wrote down the timestamp and a brief physical description in my notebook. Mass present at chamber center, roughly bilateral symmetry. Proportions inconsistent with known Chacoan skeletal morphology. I wrote it in the same handwriting I used for wall course measurements and ceramic scatter counts. It helped. Grace said, "There's one more thing." She had the steady, deliberate tone of someone delivering a briefing they've rehearsed. I requested the original 1930 excavation records for this section of the site from the National Archives 6 months ago. Records request, nothing unusual about the process. "They're missing," she said. "Not misfiled, not damaged or deteriorated. The records were removed from the archive. The request came back with a formal notation that the documents had been withdrawn from the collection. No date, no reason, no institutional signature." She paused. "Someone pulled those records. I don't know when, and I don't know who." Sally exhaled slowly beside me. I wrote that down too, in the same handwriting. We packed the equipment in the fading light, and I was reaching for my bag when Sally said, "Terry?" Not urgently, just in a tone that meant she'd found something. She was crouched near the base of the outer wall, 6 feet east of the plastered section. Her headlamp angled downward. I crossed to her, and Grace came up on my left. The access shaft was narrow, 18 inches across, maybe less. It had been covered at some point. The covering material was gone, eroded or removed, and what remained was an opening in the canyon floor that dropped vertically into darkness. I couldn't see the bottom. The sandstone walls of the shaft were not rough cut, they were scored, in parallel lines, evenly spaced, running the full visible length of the shaft's interior, spaced and angled like handholds. I crouched next to Sally and looked at the spacing. Then I looked at the angle of the cuts. My hands are 6 inches across at the knuckles. I held one hand over the shaft without touching anything and measured the spacing against my palm. The lines were too far apart. The angle was wrong for a human grip. The cut direction assumed the fingers entering those holds were approaching from a different axis, curling inward from a position that a human hand, in any orientation, could not replicate. Grace said quietly, "Don't touch the walls." I hadn't been going to. I straightened up and switched my headlamp off. The canyon had gone dark around us. The rim above edged in the last thin light. The 3 of us stood at the edge of the shaft and didn't say anything for a moment. I wrote the spacing measurements in my notebook. Then I capped my pen and put the notebook away. Nobody argued about who would go down. Grace had sight authority and a bad knee. Sally had the radar unit and needed to stay topside to monitor the return in real time. That left me, which is how I ended up sitting at the edge of an 18-inch shaft in the dark, clipping my headlamp to its chest mount and trying not to think too carefully about what I was about to do. "Radio if anything changes," I said. Sally said, "Obviously." I went feet first, the way you'd enter a chimney descent. Hips tucked, elbows out to manage lateral pressure, boots feeling for purchase on the scored walls. The handholds were wrong for my hands. I'd measured the spacing at 9 inches center to center, which meant my fingers reached but my grip angle was off. The cut, assuming an inward curl I couldn't replicate without torquing my wrist, I managed. I moved slowly, and I managed. And about 8 feet down the shaft, the smell reached me. Dry, first. That old, excavated dryness that comes off sealed spaces in the southwest. The same smell as a pot burial. The same smell as an untouched cyst. I know that smell well enough that it usually settles me. This didn't. I kept descending. The shaft opened without warning. One moment my boots were reading walls on all sides. The next, there was nothing below my left foot, and I dropped the final 4 feet before I could brace it. I landed hard on both heels, knees absorbing the impact badly, and my headlamp flooded the space around me. The walls threw the light back wrong, not reflected, thrown, distorted into long ribbons that bent at angles inconsistent with a flat surface, as if the chamber walls were reading my light and returning it along a different axis. I had half a second to register that the material was doing something optically that sandstone does not do, and then I saw the figure. It was standing at the center of the chamber, dark stone, or something that presented as dark stone in the headlamp, roughly humanoid in proportions but with the torso length and arm geometry that the radar return had suggested. Wrong ratios. Too long in the trunk, arms hung at angles that implied shoulder structure no skeletal survey I've ever produced would account for. My first thought was carved, obvious first thought. Chaco effigy, unknown type, extraordinary preservation. I moved toward it, with that frame intact for approximately 3 seconds, which is how long it took me to get close enough to see the joints. The joints were articulated, not carved articulation, actual segmented connection, with wear at the contact surfaces consistent with repeated movement, not erosion. The surface texture varied by location, smooth at the joints, slightly rougher at the planes between, exactly the pattern you'd expect from differential friction over time. I stopped moving. The figure's head turned 15 degrees, maybe slightly less, slow and deliberate, orienting toward my light with the kind of patience that implies no concept of urgency whatsoever, like something that had been in a sealed room for 900 years and has no particular feelings about whether the next 10 seconds happens quickly or slowly. I was up the shaft before I made a decision to be. I don't remember the climb. I remember my hands tearing against the scored walls, the wrong angles finding my palms, my grip slipping and catching, and I remember the circle of Sally's headlamp above me, and then I was out, on my knees, on the canyon floor, and Sally was already crouching beside me with the radar screen turned toward my face. The central mass had shifted position, not dramatically, maybe 2 feet northwest of where it had been reading for the last 3 hours, enough to be unambiguous on the return. I looked at the screen for a moment, and then I looked at my hands. The scored walls had opened the skin across both palms in parallel lines, shallow but bleeding steadily. Grace produced a first aid kit from her pack without being asked. "It moved," Sally said. "I know." "Terry, I know." Grace wrapped my right hand first, then my left. Nobody said anything else for a while. I'd taken photographs on the way down. Automatic habit. The same way I logged GPS coordinates without thinking about it. I pulled them up on my phone while Sally repacked the radar equipment, enlarging each frame, working from the shaft entrance downward. The 4th photograph stopped me. I'd caught the interior face of the filed wall at an oblique angle, the angle you only get from inside the shaft. Looking laterally at the surface the Chacoans had plastered over from the outside. The fill material caught the light differently at that angle. In the photograph, scratched into the interior face in shallow, deliberate cuts, were 4 words. "Do not open this." Not Chacoan, not petroglyph notation or any symbolic system I recognized from 900 years of occupation. Plain English. In a hand that looked neither old nor new. Someone had been here, had seen what I'd seen, or enough of it, had sealed the shaft, plastered the wall, and walked away without filing a report, without publishing, without telling anyone anything except the one thing they needed whoever came next to understand. I showed the photograph to Grace. She looked at it for a long time. "The records withdrawal," she said finally. "Yeah." She handed the phone back. Neither of us elaborated. The park closure went through by nightfall. Grace handled it. Structural instability designation. Restricted access pending assessment. The language deliberately bland. Sally and I were in my truck by 9, heading south on the dirt road back toward the highway, the headlights pulling pale caliche out of the dark ahead of us. My hands hurt. Grace had done a clean job with the bandaging, but the skin across my palms pulled with every grip on the steering wheel, and I was gripping harder than necessary. Habit, I guess, under stress. I loosened my hands consciously and they tightened again within 30 seconds. Sally sat with her tablet on her knees and didn't look at it. She watched the dark out the passenger window the whole drive, which was 3 hours, which is a long time to watch dark. I filed nothing. There was no report that would have said what happened accurately, and I wasn't willing to write one that didn't. Grace called 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, while I was standing at my kitchen counter with coffee I hadn't touched yet. "Chamber's been formally reclassified," she said. "Structurally unstable. Access is restricted indefinitely." "Understood." A pause. "How are your hands?" "Healing." Another pause, shorter. "All right," she said. "That's all I had." She ended the call. We hadn't mentioned the radar readings. We hadn't mentioned the photograph. Some things you don't say on a phone line. And some things you don't say anywhere. And by then, we both understood which category this was. Sally withdrew her thesis topic the following week. No explanation filed with the department, just the withdrawal form and a transfer request to a program in Vermont. Environmental archaeology, I heard later. Wetland sediment analysis, about as far from Chaco pre-contact sites as you can get while staying in the same discipline. I didn't call her. I didn't know what I would have said. I still teach pre-Columbian studies. I still drive Highway 550 sometimes, when field work takes me north or when I'm driving to Farmington and the route makes sense. The high desert spreads the same way it always has, flat and tawny. The basin opening past Cuba, the elevation dropping in that long exhale I've driven enough times that my body anticipates it before the landscape shows it. I don't stop at Chaco anymore. What I know is this: something is in that chamber. It has always been there for at least 900 years, possibly longer, and it is not inert. And it registered my presence the way a living thing registers a light source, by orienting toward it. Something before me knew this. They sealed it, and said nothing, and left 4 words for whoever came next. I came next. I sealed it again and said nothing. Both facts remain with me. I've stopped expecting that to change.